So the Book of Mormon. The reason that I want to address this issue, well, there are multiple reasons. First of all, I find it an interesting issue. I have no family connections with Mormonism. I actually do not have, and have never had a personal friend. I mean, someone who I actually hang out with on a regular basis, who is Mormon. Um, Nothing against them. It's just I live in Virginia, and if you want to find Mormons, you kind of have to seek them out. I have been to a Mormon church service. I have met with missionaries for several weeks. Very, very nice people. They're so nice that you almost don't want to disagree with them verbally. It's much easier to have a debate with Jehovah's Witnesses if you're looking to have a debate with missionaries. Um, but I discovered when I was 9 years old in my hotel room, I forget where we were, it might have been in Chicago, right next to my Gideon Bible in the hotel drawer was a Book of Mormon. This was the first time I'd ever seen a Book of Mormon. It's the first time I'd ever heard of such a thing. So I asked my parents, what is this book? And they kind of laughed and said, well, there are these people who believe that Jesus came to America and had prophets here and everything. And it sounded kind of nutty to me, but, so does anything to a person who's unacquainted with the system. But I was intrigued. The premise of it was intriguing. And so when I started getting into theology in a more academic sense, when I started getting into Christian apologetics, I would always kind of dip my toes in the water of Mormonism uh, to see what was going on. And one time when I was 17 years old, I was thinking about the Book of Mormon, and the way that I understood it was that it had clearly been refuted by archaeological evidence. That they had done systematic searches for Book of Mormon cities and Book of Mormon peoples, and they'd found absolutely nothing to affirm its historicity and lots to undermine it. And I thought that there must be people out there who give arguments for the historicity of the Book of Mormon, because people will argue for anything, and I was interested to see what kind of evidence and arguments they would present. So I searched Book of Mormon evidence. I found a website by this guy named Jeff Lindsay, who's kind of a lay Mormon apologist. He publishes sometimes for journals like the Interpreter Foundation. He may have published in Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. He definitely published in the Old Farms Review of Books before that became the Maxwell Institute with that whole drama. Um, and he gave a whole list of evidences, quote unquote, for the Book of Mormon. By the way, evidences, just don't use the word evidences, because for whatever reason, it's only used in context where people tend not to take you seriously. So, just in terms of your self-presentation, evidence for the Book of Mormon, arguments for the Book of Mormon, but not evidences. Creationists, my compatriots, um, do the same thing. Anyway, and I wasn't convinced by them, but I thought, these are smart guys. These guys clearly have an intellectual synthesis where they're satisfied with their Mormonism. And it's fascinating because Mormonism makes such radically empirical claims, right? So it claims that God is called a prophet in the 19th century, and has given what Catholics and Orthodox would call public revelation. That is, revelations which are authoritatively binding in view of their source on all the human family. Okay, so Catholics and Orthodox, we believe that ceased with the apostles. We still believe that God, Jesus, the Spirit, that they work to give what we would call, quote unquote, private revelations to people. Now, the boundaries there can get a little blurry, but we do believe in continuing revelation. But Mormons believe in public revelation through Joseph Smith and through his successors in the prophetic office. So the prophet presidents of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are understood to stand in the capacity to receive revelation from God for the whole church. And they made radically empirical claims about ancient America. I mean, it's quite a bold thing to assert the presence in ancient America of three enormous civilizations whose history is recorded in this book that should be pretty verifiable, but which mainstream archaeologists and historians do not acknowledge. It's a bold historical claim. And Mormons also have a very unique theological system, which, if nothing else, I think raises interesting questions for mainstream Christians to answer and helps us to frame our own theology more precisely. But another reason that I want to engage in this topic, in addition to just being kind of fascinated with the phenomenon of Mormon scholarship and apologetics, is that today there's something of a flood of people leaving the Mormon Church, okay, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church. Um, and that flood has essentially reduced to a net zero the rate of conversions into Mormonism. And I don't use the terms Mormonism, Mormon Church pejoratively. It's just, you know, it's for time's sake and convenience's sake. But it has reduced the rate of conversion dramatically from where it was in the 1980s and the 1990s. So in the 80s and 90s, particularly the 80s, lots and lots of people were converting to Mormonism. The missions program was very successful relative to where it is today. Well, today, through the internet, lots of Mormons who are rooted in old Mormon pioneer culture, those descended from Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders out in the West, are leaving Mormonism because historical information, which contradicts the church's self-presentation, has become so widely available. And this includes things like the historicity of the Book of Mormon. A Mormon who is raised in Mormon culture grows up believing the Book of Mormon is a history of the Native Americans. Okay, so that's changing somewhat, but that's still the image that most born and raised Mormons will have, especially the older ones. Mormons are raised believing that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon from gold plates in basically the way that you'll see in the image in the top center of this slide. So there's Smith, and the other guy there is Oliver Cowdery. And Smith actually has the plates in front of him. And I don't know if you see them here, but the idea is that he uses this thing called the interpreters, okay, or the Urim and Thummim, which he finds in a box with the plates. It's a Nephite artifact given by God to help him translate supernaturally, but the point is he's got the plates right there. He's using these artifacts to have a biblical root, and so on. Well, modern Mormons are learning that this actually isn't how it happened. Now the problem is, whatever you think of the actual merit of these arguments for and against Mormonism, overwhelmingly, anecdotally, but I'm sure this could be backed up from more systematic analysis, those who leave the Mormon Church are not becoming Christians. They're not becoming Christians in the Nicene sense. Overwhelmingly, they are becoming naturalists and secular progressives of one sort or another. So you're going to find in the Mormon Church that if you're a Christian and you're an ex-Mormon, it's going to be hard to really find serious compatriots on the ex-Mormon sites and forums, because what you're going to find is people who have a huge problem not only with the historicity of the Book of Mormon, but with aspects of the Bible, with Mormon teaching on homosexuality, which is basically the same as Christian teaching on same-sex relationships, which is that they're not morally licit. Marriage between one man and one woman, but of course the one woman thing is kind of complex in Mormonism, but marriage between man and woman is the sole God-ordained structure within which conjugal relations can occur. So among ex-Mormons, you don't have to search a bit to find people who agree with that. And kind of what this has done, I think, is lead to a situation in which the preference for naturalism and progressivism among people who are thinking of leaving the LDS Church is self-sustaining. Because if they look for resources that are critical of Mormonism or want to find resources to help them find meaning outside of Mormonism, those resources are really not going to be Christian resources. And even if they are Christian resources, they won't be providing an explicit reason why they should be seeking that truth and meaning and value in Christianity and not in conventional naturalism. Okay, so it used to be that kind of the default worldview of someone living in the West was a theistic Christian worldview. And so if you left Mormonism, if you left your subculture and you assimilated into the mainstream culture, well, you would become some kind of Christian. You might be a very good Christian because you would be intensely religious and you would have that sense of intense religiosity from your Mormon background. Well, today, if you assimilate from your subculture into the mainstream culture, you won't become a Christian, you'll become a conventional naturalist. And with all respect to my naturalist friends, it's as Jesus said about, you sweep the house clean, you expel the demons, and I'm using this metaphorically, and you don't replace it with anything, and you're worse than you were before. So we really need, as Christians, to be giving a serious engagement with Mormonism and to be providing people who are leaving Mormonism with alternative theistic options and say, wait, you don't have to abandon the existence of God. You don't have to abandon Christ. There's good reason to be a Christian outside of a Mormon religious context. And the third reason, I think I'm on reason 3, that I'm really engaging this subject is because there's a need for it to be engaged seriously. So it was about 20 years ago that Paul Owen and Carl Mosser, who co-edited a volume called The New Mormon Challenge, they wrote a paper, a very controversial paper called Mormon Scholarship and Evangelical Neglect, where they pointed out that the traditional kind of counter-cult approach to Mormonism, while it may have been sufficient at some point in the past, was not sufficient today because Mormons produce robust defenses of their faith in its traditional aspects. So we're talking about a situation in which you've got major archaeologists and voices in the history of the New World who are believers in the Book of Mormon. Okay, I'm talking about John Sorensen. I'm talking about John Clark, who is widely recognized outside of Mormonism for his work in the archaeology of the New World. We're talking about a situation in which the leading historian of Joseph Smith is a believer in Mormonism's supernatural claims. It's Richard Bushman, wrote Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. Now, the Joseph Smith of Bushman's biography is not the one which most Latter-day Saints are acquainted with from Sunday school, but it is a believing portrait of Joseph Smith, a Smith who really receives anciently engraved gold plates and translates them into a text which is substantially based in the real history of this continent. We're talking about a situation in which there are credentialed Egyptologists who will defend the authenticity of the Book of Abraham. Now, in that case, I think the apologetic scholarship is of a substantially lower quality, but nevertheless, they're real scholars. These are real Egyptologists. It's no good to say, well, they're not real scholars because they started with a position and they're writing to defend a position they started with, because this is basically what everyone has to do as a matter of course. The whole idea that academics, scientists, historians start with this mass of unorganized data and then kind of collate it into a model which evolves organically from the disorganized data. It's just nonsense. Nobody actually works that way. We start with paradigms which we've received for whatever reason we've received from whomever we've received them, and then we work to fit the data into that paradigm or interpret reality in light of that paradigm. And if there's tension, we have to alter our paradigm and we kind of mold it in a creative engagement with the actual data. So this Paul Feyerabend, his work on the philosophy of science, books like Against the Method, have been very influential for how I see that process. So Mormons do produce real scholars, they do produce real scholarship, and it's work that needs to be engaged and answered. So, this is what I want to do today. This will be the first of maybe 2 or 3 videos addressing the question of the antiquity of the Book of Mormon and what the evidence really indicates as to its production context. I'll get into that phrase in a bit. And more importantly, how we should ask this question. Because the how of asking the question is just as or more important than the actual data, which will help to answer the question. I think that a lot of Mormon scholarship when it's used for apologetic purposes, depends on a misconstruction of the how of the question. Okay, so the Book of Mormon, ancient or modern, is one of those two things. It's either produced by Israelites or by ancient Americans of roughly Israelite extraction, or it's produced by someone living in the 19th century, whether that is Smith or Smith with some others, whether it's Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon. We'll get into that. So I just want to explain to you the 4 pictures that we have here. We have on the bottom left, that is Central America. This is Central America marked out according to the Sorensen model of Book of Mormon geography. So John Sorensen is basically the architect of contemporary Book of Mormon studies in the context of ancient Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica is where academic Mormons will say the Book of Mormon happened. Over the past 10 years, you've had a wave of lay Mormons saying, no, it was the North American heartland. And that model deserves serious engagement. I think Mormon scholars have been unduly dismissive of the arguments for it, because obviously, even though I don't think it's historical, I think many of the arguments that they make for the text situation in that cultural context mitigate powerfully against the Mesoamerican model. But we'll be dealing with the Mesoamerican model mostly because that's the one that FAIR farms when it was around as farms. The Interpreter, major Mormon scholarly sources, Book of Mormon Central, they roll with the Mesoamerican model. And actually, church-sponsored movies and film will always show it in a Mesoamerican context. So there's this movie Testament, which is about the ministry of Jesus in Palestine. And kind of it splits between Palestine and then what's going on concurrently in the New World. It's a Mesoamerican setting. You can see Mesoamerican temples. And on that Mesoamerican setting, you can see at the top left, that is a Mesoamerican temple. Now, the Mesoamerican temple is structured as a stepped pyramid, like many temples are around the world. It has an altar, which is on the outside, likewise, converging with the basic temple model that you find in China and India, in Mesopotamia, and elsewhere. And the idea of the temple is that of a heavenly ascent. So you ascend through these various steps, and you enter into the heavenly council where the presence of the gods is. So this model, and its similarity to the Israelite model, has been noted by a number of Mormon scholars. Problem is that they're only looking at Mesoamerica and ancient Israel, when really, if you expand your purview, you find that this model is everywhere. It's in ancient India, Old World India, ancient China, and so on. And I don't think secular scholarship has a good explanation for why this basic matrix of ideas is so prevalent. But just something to note in terms of how we're looking at the question. So the top middle, we've already mentioned this. This is a very common church painting of the translation of the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon is dictated by Joseph Smith, and the person who took that dictation and wrote it down is a guy named Oliver Cowdery. Earlier, it had been Martin Harris, but the manuscript which Harris wrote down has since been lost. It's the lost 116 pages. We have about 20 to 25%, if I remember correctly, of the original handwritten Book of Mormon manuscript. It was actually buried under the corner of the Nauvoo house when Joseph Smith lived there, and so most of it was destroyed through water damage, but about 20-25% is still legible. So we can do handwriting analysis on this. We can see, okay, Oliver Cowdery, as the early account said, overwhelmingly was the scribe for the extant Book of Mormon text. And then we have in the top right, this is how the translation actually happened. So the LDS Church has not been very forthcoming about this. They've kind of shot themselves in the foot by not being forthcoming about it. Had they been more forthcoming about their own history historically, it wouldn't have seemed to many believing Mormons so bizarre and struck them as if the church had misled them. Because the fact is, there is no historical evidence that Joseph Smith had the plates even in the room much of the time. Definitely no evidence that he actually used them in any substantial way in the translation of the Book of Mormon text. He seemed to have had them buried outside or in some box most of the time. Mormon scholars give varying answers as to why he needed the plates. Probably the best answer would be as kind of a sign that he was translating an actual text and not just creating something out of his mind. You can see his face is buried in a hat. What he has in that hat is this thing called a seer stone. Now, a seer stone is something that's used in folk magical contexts around the world. It's hardly unique to Joseph Smith's time and place. I mean, you can see it today. People look into crystal balls and use that for occultic practices. It's called scrying. But Smith would have used it for seeking for buried treasure or trying to find lost items. So if a person had lost something of value to them, they'd go to Joseph Smith, say, look in your seer stone and see if you can find something for me. And while he never found any buried treasure, he did reportedly find lost objects. We might talk about this and its significance for our explanatory toolkit in another video. But he's looking in the hat, and what he sees, according to Smith, is text appear in kind of letters of light, and then he reads out what the text appearing on the seer stone is saying, and Oliver Cowdery writes it down. So this shows, it's kind of a symbol of the difference between the received narrative and the historical narrative. But we have to be straightforward here and say that part of the reason that Smith, or that the church reported the narrative the way that it's shown in the middle picture is because Joseph Smith himself, very early on in his prophetic career, seemed to mislead people about the actual nature of the translation, talking about Urim and Thummim, or Nephite interpreters, instead of the seer stone, which is what he actually used, the seer stone which preceded his prophetic calling. So, those are the big issues. So, I want to give you an outline of Book of Mormon history because I want this to be intelligible to people who might not be so familiar with Mormonism. The Book of Mormon tells a story rooted in 3 distinct migrations from the Old World. Okay, first, you have the Jaredites. Okay, the Jaredite narrative is given near the end of the Book of Mormon text in the Book of Ether. The Jaredites begin with a guy named Jared and his brother. And they pray to God that he would not confound their language when he's about to confound the language of the people at the Tower of Babel. And God says, okay, God does not confound their language. And then they and a number of other families journey to the New World in what the Book of Mormon calls barges. These barges are basically submarines. Their description is given relatively precisely. And you can read about that in the Book of Ether. But the Jaredites are said to be the greatest civilization in the world of their time. They came into an empty New World, if we take the text at a prima facie level. And they turn into a great civilization, but eventually, because of their rebellion against God, they self-destruct, and they pass knowledge of their existence to a group called the Mulekites, and I'll mention them in a few moments. The main narrative of the Book of Mormon is concerned with the Lehites, and that word, Lehite, is never actually used in the Book of Mormon. It's used to refer to everyone who is descended from the original Lehite party. But Lehi is the character around whom the Book of Mormon begins. He is an Israelite prophet, and he's said to be descended from Joseph. So I believe he's descended from the tribe of Manasseh, where Joseph is split into two half-tribes. You can read about that at the end of the book of Genesis. But Lehi is of Josephite descent. So the major point here is that his association is with the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is repeatedly called Ephraim, because that's one of the two half-tribes of Joseph. Just like the southern kingdom is called by the name Judah, the northern kingdom is called by the name Ephraim. Jacob says at the end of the book of Genesis, "My name will go through you," speaking to the Josephite tribes, and that's why the northern kingdom gets called Israel, and the southern kingdom is called Judah. The name of Jacob goes through those northern tribes. But when the Assyrians carry off the northern tribes into exile, the implication is that Lehi comes south, and he lives in Jerusalem. Now there's a bit of a confusion here, because he's said to have a land of his inheritance here in the territory of Jerusalem, which doesn't make all that much sense given that he's supposed to be from a northern tribe and should have inheritance in the north, but I think that's one of the inconsistencies that you just find in the text, and I don't know if or how Mormon scholars have really addressed that. But he lives in and around Jerusalem with his family. He's called by God to preach against the wickedness of the people, much like Jeremiah, and then he's told by God to flee Jerusalem and go to a new land, a land of promise. And this is right before the exile. So it's around 600 BC. It's said to be 600 years before the coming of Christ. So Lehi and his family, together with a few others, a guy named Zoram and a guy named Ishmael and his descendants, they sail to the Americas. The book of 1st Nephi describes in some detail the migration of the Lehites through the Old World, generally taken to be Arabia. But once they arrive in the Americas, they split into two factions. One of these factions is named for a guy named Nephi, and he's the younger brother, and he has a brother named Sam. And also Jacob and Joseph are sons of Lehi who joined with the Nephite party. And Nephi is understood in terms of the biblical Joseph. He's described in language that recalls the figure of Joseph. He is the younger brother who is promised to rule over the older brothers, and the older brothers are jealous of this promise. He rebukes his older brothers. His older brothers are Laman, Lemuel. And then the Ishmaelites also joined with the Lamanite faction. So soon after they get to the New World, after Lehi dies, the Nephite and Lamanites physically separate. The Lamanites are immediately rebellious, and they're cursed with dark skin. So this is the prima facie reading of the text. This is how pretty much everyone read the text until just a few decades ago. For obvious reasons, this is not something which is particularly amenable to Mormon or non-Mormon in the modern world, so various ways have been constructed to reinterpret this text. Sometimes this is held to be kind of an ancient Hebrew figure of speech. Sometimes a Mormon scholar would simply say, as John Quetness suggested, that yes, it does mean that God cursed them with dark skin, but God didn't actually curse them with dark skin. That was the racist prejudice of the ancient authors of the Book of Mormon. So this is an interesting thing. The Book of Mormon says, if there are flaws, let them be attributed to men and not to God. So the idea that the Book of Mormon has mistakes in it is acceptable to most Mormons, because the Book of Mormon says it may well have mistakes in it. But those mistakes would be attributed to the ancient authors and not to Joseph Smith in general. But the prima facie reading here is that the Nephites, they are a white Israelite civilization. The Lamanites are dark-skinned, red-skinned. And then around 200 BC, the Nephites come across another group who are descended from Israelites, and this group is descended from a group of refugees who was led by Mulek. Now, Zedekiah was the king whose sons were killed in front of him, and then his eyes were put out. That's described in the Book of Kings. The Book of Mormon says he had another son named Mulek, and Mulek escaped the Babylonians, and he was led to the New World. But the Mulekites have had their language corrupted. They've forgotten a large part of their religion. This is a major event in Book of Mormon history. But the Nephites join with the Mulekite group, and they become one people. So from that point onward, Nephite refers to that kind of fusion of Nephite Josephites and Mulekite Judahites. The major event, the crowning event of the Book of Mormon, is in 34 AD, when Jesus, after his resurrection and ascension, visits the New World. He gives the people his teaching, he gives them a number of prophecies, he gives them something like Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but the most important thing he does in terms of Book of Mormon history is he reunites these two nations. The schism between the Nephites and the Lamanites is overcome, the breach is healed, and there is a Christian utopia for around 200 years. People hold all property in common as they did in the Book of Acts. People serve the Lord with one mouth and one heart. But in the book of 4th Nephi, it's a very short book, we're given a summary statement on how around 200 AD they began to abandon that Christian teaching. Different churches began to appear in the land. People start to become wicked. They factionalize again. So you see Nephite and Lamanite tribal identifications appearing again. And by the 4th century AD, which is the time of Mormon and Moroni, all the people, both Nephite and Lamanite, have been wicked. And there's lots and lots of war throughout the land. And the last major historical event in the Lehite history is the Lamanites totally destroyed the Nephites in a series of great battles, the last of which occurs around the hill Cumorah. And then Moroni, who is the son of Mormon, takes the plates which have been engraved and he seals them up. He places them in the earth together with this thing called the Liahona, which we won't get into. And the breastplate of Laban. Laban is the guy from whom they got their Old Testament scriptural writings. We're about to get into that. He puts them in a box and he seals them up in the earth, and that's where Joseph Smith gets them in 1827. So that's your outline of Book of Mormon history for those who are not familiar with it. So, I want to look at the text itself. The text of the Book of Mormon, obviously, it is presented to us as an ancient text. The way that it is presented in the officially published edition, with its chapter and verse numbers, with its book headings named by particular prophetic figures, it's presented to us in a way that resembles the Bible very much. But it actually has a lot of differences from the way the Bible is supposed to have been written, even on a traditionally Christian believing sense. Obviously, the whole thing about biblical criticism, it would radically differ from that, but we're going to ignore biblical criticism for the purposes of today's discussion. So the ultimate sources of the Book of Mormon text, as we have it, are basically four. First, you've got the brass plates of Laban. Now, the brass plates are a large collection of engraved metal. Some Mormon scholars would say that they're bronze plates, and the reason it's called brass is because in the KJV, with which Smith was familiar, bronze was rendered into English as brass. So this has to do with your translation theory, which we'll get into. The brass plates originate entirely in the Old World. We're told in the book of 1st Nephi that they have things like Lehi's genealogy on them. So on this basis, Mormon scholars generally say that they're associated with the northern 10 tribes. They have the writings of Isaiah on them. They have the 5 books of Moses on them. So we're explicitly told by the Book of Mormon that the 5 books of Moses are engraved on the breastplates, which makes the attempted accommodation of source criticism by certain Mormon scholars rather puzzling. Some have said rather desperately, well, it had 5 books, but these aren't the 5 books with which we are familiar. I mean, honestly, come on. Clearly, the author of the Book of Mormon believed there to be a 5-book Torah. Ironically enough, I believe that, but many non-Christian critics of the Book of Mormon present this as an anachronism. Another thing is Nephi quotes extensively from the book of Isaiah as we have it. So including chapters which are described by modern secular scholars as productions of the Babylonian exile. Again, ironically, this has taken an increasingly central role in criticism of the Book of Mormon because they believe it's an anachronism, because they believe that these sections of Isaiah were written after Lehi supposedly left Jerusalem. I don't consider it a problem at all because I think Isaiah was written under the direction of the prophet himself during the reign of King Hezekiah and possibly Manasseh, his successor. So, whatever. But they're said to contain the Book of Isaiah, the 5 books of Moses, and they contain the writings of some non-biblical prophets. So we have in the book of Jacob, which is the book immediately succeeding 2nd Nephi, an extensive quotation from an Israelite prophet called Zenos, and then we also have Zenoch, who's occasionally quoted. Then there's another prophet who's said to be on the plates. I don't think he's ever quoted. He's called Nahum, N-E-U-M. And then another prophet called Ezias, E-Z-I-A-S. So these 4 non-biblical prophets are included with Isaiah and the books of Moses as being part of the content of the brass plates. And then the 5 books of Moses, which are included in the plates, seem to differ in some respects from the 5 books of Moses as we have them. For example, they contain a prophecy of Joseph about the Nephites. So after Joseph Smith finishes the Book of Mormon, he begins his revision, or his quote-unquote retranslation of the Bible, where he expands the biblical text in a number of ways. And one of the ways in which he expands the text is by including Joseph's prophecy of the Lehites. A large part of that expansion of the book of Genesis is included in the LDS scriptural canon as what they today call the Book of Moses. It seems to me that Smith meant his readers to understand his Book of Moses to be a representation of what was on the brass plates of Laban, to be a restoration of certain things which have been removed, allegedly, by later Jewish scribes. So that's the brass plates. And the brass plates are essential to the Nephite identity. They contain the scriptures, and they sustain the memory of Israelite origin. So the Mulekites do not carry a scriptural record, and they lose, in large part, their religious identity. And they value the presence of the brass plates among the Nephites. Then you have these Jaredite plates. So there are 24 Jaredite plates. And these are engraved by a Jaredite prophet named Ether, from which we get the name of the Book of Mormon, Book of Ether. And these 24 plates are translated by seer stones by King Messiah, who is a Nephite king. He said to translate them by the gift and power of God, the same way Joseph Smith said that he translated the gold plates of the Book of Mormon. Then we have these large plates of Nephi, which seem to be related or identical to the plates of Lehi. But the large plates are these official historical records of the Nephite nation. And they seem to be kept or guarded by the Nephite kings, and after the kingship is abolished, by the Nephite judges. And then you have the small plates, which are Nephite prophetic records from Nephi himself and then some other Book of Mormon prophets before the time of Christ. Now, out of these 4 metal sources, the only one which is actually included in the Book of Mormon are the small plates. The other plates are related to the Book of Mormon through intermediary forms. So the most important intermediate between these plates and the text of the Book of Mormon engraved on the alleged gold plates, most important is Mormon himself. Mormon writes the main narrative of the Book of Mormon. So when you read the Book of Mormon, when you look in its table of contents, you'll see that the books have been distinguished into separate books with headers like Mosiah, Alma, Helaman, 3rd Nephi, and you would think, just from the biblical analog, that these are signifying the different authors of the Book of Mormon, but that's not true. All of those books are believed to have been written by Mormon himself. Mormon is looking at the large plates, these official state records, and he's abridging them to create a overall history of the Nephite and Lamanite nations. That begins with the Book of Lehi, which I'll mention in a few moments. And he ends his abridgment with his Book of Mormon, which is a little b, Book of Mormon. So it's the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon. And that is supposed to be an abridgment of the whole history of the Nephite nation. He has a son named Moroni. Now Moroni adds to his father's record by, first of all, looking at the translation of the Jaredite plates by King Mosiah into the Nephite language, and he then abridges that. And he creates a abridged version called the Book of Ether, which gets attached to the back end of the Book of Mormon. And then he follows it with the Book of Moroni. And the Book of Moroni is basically a handbook for church order. As a non-believer in Book of Mormon historicity, I would say that it's at this point that Smith is considering subconsciously or consciously how they're going to build their church in the Book of Mormon, and something like the Book of Moroni comes in handy. And it contains some epistles that Moroni received from his father Mormon. One of them condemns infant baptism, and then there's some final remarks, including the famous promise of Moroni, which says, if you pray about the Book of Mormon to God, he will give you a witness by the Holy Ghost that it is a true historical record. Interestingly, Moroni's promise is addressed to the Lamanites. So actually the idea is that the Native American is going to pray about the Book of Mormon, and God is going to confirm to him that yes, he is of Israelite descent, he is a member of these Israelite covenants, and that the Book of Mormon is a true record of his Israelite history so that he can be regathered into his land of promise. It's a somewhat different issue. The small plates are said to be engravings from prophets and their descendants, beginning with Nephi, then going to his younger brother Jacob, and then onward from there. And these are the only actual engravings that are supposedly written prior to the coming of Christ. And then they're attached to the main text by Mormon. Now, I think the story about the small plates is really important because there's lots of things in the Book of Mormon which are hard to understand as a pre-Christian writing. The problem is that without the small plates, without 1 Nephi to the words of Mormon, you could say that this is due to Mormon's post-Christ redaction, that Mormon is reading Nephite history in Christian light. But we read in the small plates a very clear and straightforward Christian doctrine, which is actually physically engraved prior to the coming of Christ. So I think it creates a problem for defenders of historicity, but we'll talk about this precise issue another time. Now Moroni seals up the text of the Book of Mormon together with the Nephite interpreters, which are the Urim and Thummim, to translate the book, the sword of Laban, and the breastplate of Laban, which is what you wear when you're using the Nephite interpreters. The traditional story is that in 1823, Joseph Smith is in his room praying, and he receives a visitation from the angel Moroni. And this is the same Moroni who is the prophet of the Book of Mormon, who seals it up. So remember, Mormonism does not believe that humans and angels are distinct kinds of beings. So an angel is simply a human in a different stage in its eternal progression. So it might be a pre-existent spirit who hasn't yet come to Earth, or it might be a human who has died and been and is on his road to exaltation. So Moroni is said to be physically resurrected and exalted into the presence of God, and then he works as an angel under God's direction. So the story is that Smith is praying in his room. The angel Moroni appears to him, tells him there's this record that is engraved by my people. You will find it at this particular hill. And Smith goes to retrieve it, and he's told you're not worthy to retrieve it yet. And then he supposedly goes every year to meet with Moroni until 1827, when he actually gets the plates, as well as the Nephite interpreters. Now, if we're looking at this from an historical point of view, the identification of the spirit as the angel Moroni seems to come later. Early on, the best we can tell is that it's an angel. So before Smith develops the idea that angels and humans are the same kind of being, the same class of being, and actually that they're on a continuity with God himself, early in Mormon history, for 1835 or so, he doesn't seem to have that idea, and it's just an angel or a spirit. Moreover, in the account that we have of the appearance of the angel Moroni to Joseph Smith, it's very much a physical, concrete account. This is something which happens in Smith's room while he's praying. But if you actually look at the house in which they lived, there's no way Smith was alone in that room. In fact, the evidence is very strong that he slept in the same room with several of his brothers. And yet, none of them were aware of this appearance. None of them participated in it by any evidence that we have. And you could say as an ad hoc device that, well, God supernaturally kept them from waking up. And I suppose that would be consistent, but it seems that that would be notable in Smith's record, that God was miraculously keeping his brothers, who were all there in the room, from waking up. And more problematically, we actually have earlier accounts of this precise event from Joseph Smith's father, who tells it to another person who reports it to us in 1833. And in this account, what we hear is that it was a dream that Joseph had of a spirit or an angel showing him where there were these buried gold plates. And Joseph Smith Sr. is not the only person to give us that kind of account. Martin Harris, who is one of the 3 Book of Mormon witnesses, who knew Smith in 1827, who was his scribe for the 116 pages, tells us the same thing, that this was a dream Joseph had. Now, I don't want to get this in detail right now, but this dream makes sense in its own context. So, as Mormonism develops as a religious movement, it is recontextualized, I would argue, in a very biblical, traditionally Christian setting. But Smith himself is not living in that traditionally religious setting. Smith is living in a religiously complex household where so-called folk magic and treasure digging is a major part of his family culture. And this was not seen to be contradictory to Christianity, but it's not something which would be recognized as having a serious place in quote-unquote mainstream or orthodox Christianity, but it's part of his family history. But the idea that there's a guardian spirit for a golden treasure that's hidden in the earth, and that this spirit would appear to someone through a dream to tell them where they might find this treasure. Stories like that are rife within that folk magical culture. And so if you want to trace the story of the appearance of this heavenly being back into 1823 itself, then it makes most sense in that folk magical, largely non-religious context. And it seems to become more and more religious as time goes on, until Smith essentially eliminates its original folk magical context. I think intentionally, because once he moves out of upstate New York, he's moving into a new context where people are not familiar with or sympathetic to that folk magic. And this is something you see him do in his other revelations, in his other re-narration of his own history. Just to give you one more example, to show I'm not making things up, early revelations in the 1833 Book of Commandments, this is kind of an early version of the Doctrine and Covenants, it describes Oliver Cowdery as having the gift of working with the rod, and this is a divining rod. So the divining rod is used in traditional cultures to find sources of water. It's actually still used today by professionals who work in laying pipes for our modern water system. It's kind of an open secret. You know, its mechanism is disputed, but apparently it does have some basis for working. Just throwing that out there. So I'm not prejudiced against this stuff, but it was also used for divination. So this is kind of where it gets into the biblical territory of condemnation. You would ask questions of a spirit or the heavenly realm, and the rod could point yes or no. So Oliver Cowdery is said to have the gift of working with the rod. And when he wants to translate from the Book of Mormon, it seems that the mechanism of translation is going to be the divining rod. Well, when Joseph Smith moves into a new context, he knows, apparently, that this would not be acceptable to the people among whom he's now working, and so he edits this revelation in the 1833 Book of Commandments to be the gift of Aaron, which, Aaron has a rod that blossoms. But Smith is recontextualizing these originally folk magical ideas in a biblical context and making them more acceptable to the people among whom he's working. But the small plates, their function in the Book of Mormon as we have it, is to replace the lost 116 pages. So the lost 116 pages, this is the earliest part of the Book of Mormon. They were transcribed by Martin Harris. The pace of dictation was much slower at that point in time. And Joseph is translating from the Book of Lehi. As with the other books in the Book of Mormon, this does not indicate authorship. This is part of Mormons, the Book of Mormon prophet. This is abridgment. It's abridgment of the earliest part. And it may have included the early chapters of Messiah as well. But the Book of Lehi was abridged by Mormon, and Martin Harris has about 116 pages, that abridgment. He begs Joseph to be able to take it and show his wife, because Martin Harris is a relatively wealthy guy. He's financing this project, spending a lot of money on it. His wife is skeptical. Reportedly, he promises that he's only going to show it to a select few people, but he ends up showing it to a lot more people, and somehow the 116 pages get lost. Most historians today think that they were burned by Lucy Harris, who eventually leaves Martin over this whole issue. Martin Harris returns. He tells Joseph, "I've lost the pages, I don't know where they are." Joseph is devastated. He then says he's had a revelation, rebuking Martin Harris and rebuking Joseph Smith for allowing Martin Harris to take the 116 pages. And Smith is told that what happened to the pages is that this group of wicked men has taken the manuscript and is systematically altered its content, so that when Joseph presumably retranslates the content of the Book of Lehi, they'll bring forth the 116 pages and say, "Hey, these don't agree with each other. What are you doing? Clearly, you're making this all up." So this has been an issue for Mormons and non-Mormons in dialogue from the beginning. That at a prima facie level, this seems like a pretty poor excuse to cover up the fact that Smith could not reproduce the Book of Lehi miraculously, because it was coming from his own mind and did not have a textual basis. And I notice a point of contrast that Jeremiah has some of his dictated prophecies destroyed, and Jeremiah's response is to redictate those prophecies word for word. I mean, it's kind of a joke that people thought they could destroy the words of God by destroying the manuscript, because obviously God remembered what he said. But for Smith, he is not supposed to retranslate it, because apparently these wicked men have altered the manuscript very cleverly. That's the story that he gets in Doctrine and Covenants. And I don't know that Mormon scholars have really grappled with the fact that historically this is actually what they're required to believe about the Book of Lehi. I mean, God tells him, not this is what might have happened, but this is what happened to the 116 pages. They've been stolen and altered. whereas historically they were probably destroyed. The fact that they have not come out by this point is pretty good evidence uh, on a prima facie reading of the data that these pages were burned by Lucy Harris, who was pissed off that Martin was spending so much of their money on the Book of Mormon, which she thought was a fraud. Anyway, this creates a problem in that it has taken the beginning of Smith's narrative. So it has to be replaced, but Smith or God does not want to replace it with the actual Book of Lehi. So what we're told is that God had foreseen this whole series of events. And because he foresaw this whole series of events, he commanded Nephi to engrave a smaller set of plates, which goes over the same historical period that his larger plates, which remember are the source of Mormon's abridgment. It covers the same period, but it focuses not so much on their history, on their wars, but more on the prophetic and religious aspects of their life. And so that's where you get 1st and 2nd Nephi. 1st Nephi is a telling of the Lehite exodus from Jerusalem to the New World. 2nd Nephi has got a lot of doctrinal teaching in it. You have 12 chapters of Isaiah stuck in there. And then after that you have various Book of Mormon prophets prophesying of Christ, rebuking their people, so on and so forth. But this is all presented as the translation of the small plates, which was arranged by God providentially because he knew that the 116 pages would be lost, that wicked men would try to alter their content. And so he's commanded this whole series of events, including the engraving of a whole different set of plates so that they could replace it. That's the narrative as Smith presents it. So that's why we have the small plates. But Mormon himself does not know, why these small plates have been produced. He just knows that God has commanded their production, and so he attaches them to his Book of Mormon, which is a 7-book abridgment of the Nephite history, or the Lehite history. So this is how the text presents its own creation. Probably the most rigorous, faithful interpretation of the creation of the text of the Book of Mormon would be by Brant Gardner, who has a new book coming out on the production of the Book of Mormon text, the original plates. Notably here, I want you to pay attention to the fact that all of these texts are written on metal plates. Now, the Book of Mormon mentions texts which were not written on plates, but attempts to situate the production of metal plates specifically in Lehi's context seems to run into a huge problem, for me at least, which is that the Jaredite plates are a thing. Now, the Jaredites have no historical connection to Israelite culture. Their last connection to the Old World was before the Tower of Babel. Now, there have been attempts to demythologize this, to say, well, the tower from which Jared and his brother fled was not, in fact, the Tower of Babel. I think that's just total nonsense, given what the text tells us. But that argument has been made, that it's an artifact of a mistranslation through the seer stone. Now, I'm summarizing it a lot. Brant Gardner has made the case in a much more intelligent way, but I don't think it can really be seriously defended. And the ironic thing is, he's saying that because he doesn't believe in the Tower of Babel. I do. I mean, I believe in things which would be considered by secular scholars just as nuts as a historical Book of Mormon. So be careful before making fun of the Mormons for believing something you think is nutty. As traditional Christians, we believe lots of nutty things. Anyway, but the problem is that you have these metal plates that are produced by Jaredites who don't have a connection with the Israelite culture or any other distinct Old World culture, because they have a pre-Babel language, which is not Hebrew. For the Book of Mormon, Hebrew is not the original language of mankind, which was the traditional Jewish and Christian understanding. By the way, Smith is fascinated by the original language throughout his life. We won't get into that now, but it's an interesting point to see this begin in the Book of Mormon and continue throughout his life, the original Adamic language. You can see it in his production of the Book of Abraham, just to give one example. But the fact that the Jaredites are writing on metal indicates to me that this is a literary motif that transcends any particular culture. So you'll find someone like Bill Hamblin, who's a professor at BYU, arguing that metal plates is a specific phenomenon that you can trace to the Mediterranean about 600 BC. On two fronts, I think that's just wrong. First of all, the jaredite plates aren't explained by this. And second of all, the plates on which texts are being engraved that you can find on lots of Mormon websites. You could use the actual books of Mormon that used to be published by the LDS Church would have a front page showing pictures of these metal plates. They are very small texts, but what we have in the Book of Mormon is a situation where in 600 BC, you have an Israelite aristocrat, not the king, mind you, but just an aristocrat, just a wealthy man who has land and an inheritance. He has a copy of the entirety of the Torah, plus biblical and non-biblical prophets, all of which are engraved on metal plates. And this is an enormous text to be engraved on metal. It would be hugely expensive. And given the preservation rate of metal, I would expect to find some representatives in the ancient world from archaeology of large texts being engraved on metal, if such texts actually existed. All of the examples of writing on metal plates that will be presented by Mormon scholars from the ancient world are shorter texts, and calling them plates kind of rigs the game, because, oh, you call them plates, it sounds like the gold plates of the Book of Mormon. But, these are pieces of metal on which small texts are being inscribed. There is a copy of the Aaronic blessing, for example, is engraved on metal, but it's just a couple of verses. If an aristocrat owns this huge book of plates, it sounds like the production of sacred texts on metal plates is a widespread phenomenon, not the peculiarity of just the royal family or something, in which case it's strange that we don't actually have any of these texts written on plates. And I'll mention, contrary to what some Mormon scholars have said, we do know of examples from Joseph Smith's own time and place of people talking about books in the Indian mounds that are supposedly written on plates. So Flunn Brodie, in her famous biography of Joseph Smith, she gives an example of I think it was 1823, there's a newspaper report in upstate New York about some guy who found brass plates in one of these Indian mounds. So this is not something that is unique to the ancient world, which Joseph Smith anticipated. And the language of the Book of Mormon, which I should have included in the slide summary, the language of the Book of Mormon is something called Reformed Egyptian. So a lot of non-Mormons or critics of Mormonism have gotten a lot of mileage out of saying Reformed Egyptian. We don't know of any such language. To me, this does not seem like the best argument in the world, because Reformed Egyptian just means Egyptian characters which have been reformed. Okay, so reformed does not have a capital R. Okay, and I think Mormon scholars have a perfectly reasonable point on that, which is that this is not being used as a proper name. Mormon and Moroni are just saying, we've altered the Egyptian characters. So, Reformed Egyptian. And then, I guess some evangelical scholars used to say, I personally have not heard it, but it sounds like something that old countercultists would say, have said that an Israelite would never use the Egyptian language because Egypt was unholy or something. That's just baloney. I mean, Egypt is actually, relative to a lot of other nations in the Bible, given a positive evaluation. So, their history is not limited to their role in the Exodus. You have a righteous Egypt under the rule of Joseph. You have another righteous Egypt that partners with King Solomon and enters into a marriage alliance with King Solomon. You have a pharaoh who fights with King Josiah, who apparently had received revelation from God. You read about this in the Book of Chronicles. Point being, the idea that for Israel, Egypt was uniquely unholy is totally unsubstantiated. So the Book of Mormon presents itself as being engraved on Reformed Egyptian characters. Whether this applies to the small plates is less clear, because the motive for reforming the Egyptian language as you read it in Mormon and Moroni, is that this tradition has been handed down from their fathers, from Antiquity, and over time, throughout the generations, they have altered the characters. So both the Hebrew and the Egyptian has been altered by us, they say. However, the small plates are actually written by someone, they're begun by someone, who began in the Old World, who had lived in Jerusalem, and so would have had an Old World Egyptian script. This is what I'll just read for you, the opening passage from the Book of Mormon. Nephi, 1 Nephi 1:2, he says, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. So the straightforward interpretation of this is that it's written in the Egyptian language, not Reformed Egyptian, but Egyptian, and its content is Jewish. So it's the learning of the Jews, and then the language, script and language of the Egyptians. I think that's pretty straightforward, but a lot of Mormon scholars, for whatever reason, want to say it's written in Hebrew. I see no evidence of that. It presents it as being written in the Egyptian language, not Hebrew in an Egyptian script, but in the Egyptian language. Now, we actually do have a sample of characters from Joseph Smith in the so-called characters document. This is sometimes called the Anthon transcript. Kind of summary of what had happened was Martin Harris spending a lot of money. He wants some reason to think that this is actually real, that Smith is not just conning him. So Smith looks at the plates, and he makes a copy of characters from the plates. Martin Harris takes it up to be examined by scholars of Old World languages, specifically a guy named Charles Anthon. And what Harris says is that Anthon verified that it was a genuine script. This is a genuinely ancient language. And Martin Harris celebrated, and then Anthon gave him a signed affidavit, and then Anthon said, by the way, where does this come from? And Martin Harris said, oh, it comes from an angel, and then Anthon tore it up and everything. Now, to me, this story does not make much sense, because even modern Mormon scholars could not verify it as coming from an ancient language, so why am I supposed to put credence in Anthon's supposed verification of it as coming from a genuine ancient language? Anthon later said that when he saw it, he knew it was a fraud from the first moment. I mean, who knows what he actually said. My point is that it doesn't actually matter. Anyway, you do have this document, the Anthon transcript, and we have a document which claims to be the Anthon transcript, but it doesn't match Charles Anthon's description of it, which is characters which are arranged vertically, and then something looking like the Mexican calendar. What we seem to have is a copy of characters that were on the Anthon transcript by David Whitmer. So this comes through the Whitmer family. The Whitmers were a major presence in early Mormonism. Though they leave Mormonism, they continue to affirm the historicity of the Book of Mormon. They say Smith was a fallen prophet. But that is where we actually get what is today called the Anthon transcript. So we can actually look at these characters, and while comparisons have been made to ancient Egyptian, the most straightforward comparison of the characters to any known language is English, what some call deformed English. Dan Vogel has a 3-part series on the characters document, which is just excellent. The Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, on their website, they have a really remarkable picture of the characters, which when they are kind of spun around in certain ways, you can write every character in the English alphabet intelligibly using these things on the characters document and numbers 1 to 9. So the evidence seems to be that this language, the only example of actual Book of Mormon engravings, is derived from English. But, you know, it is what it is. Mormons and non-Mormons will continue to debate that, but even LDS scholars make no claim to be able to really identify the ancient roots of the supposed Book of Mormon characters. Okay.